Hello, welcome back. I'm the Grouchy Historian. Moving on to our next time period in AP World History, covering the years from about 1750 to 1900. Again, as always, this is not meant to be a totally comprehensive review, but a sort of survey overview. And as always, I recommend that you get a study guide, use the study guide, take the practice exams. Let's get going. Now, you'll probably noticed as we've gone through the course that the time periods have been chopped up into shorter pieces. Well, there's a very good reason for this, because there's a whole lot going on in this time period. Coming out of the rise of Europe and exploration of the New World, we're now going to get into probably the most significant 100 years in Europe, in world history, in terms of technology and changes across the globe. So let's get started. Mandatory quote, as always, the same. All right, overarching themes. Of course, this is the era of European dominance. The Industrial Revolution, imperialism and colonialism, the development of the modern nation state. All of these are terms that could be applied and themes that could be applied across all aspects of the test. I would expect that, particularly the document-based question or the longer essay question. More importantly, I think you'll see during this period that there's a much greater interconnection of global events, social, political, economic, and military than previous periods. Because the world is, to use a term, much more globally connected, events that happen in one place of the world very rapidly have an effect on other places of the world. And we'll discuss some of this a little bit in a few minutes. And of course, we see the rise of nationalism, not just in Europe, but globally. We will see sort of the emergence of cultural and linguistic societies that begin to develop their own identity. And this, of course, is going to reach its climax in we'll call it the decolonialization of a good chunk of the world in the 20th century. So all of these themes, keep in mind as we go through the rest of this, particularly the interconnection of events and the development of nationalism and the modern nation state. Okay, let's start with significant political upheaval, right? We talked about on the last review about the rise of the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the philosophers that started really looking at economic science and political science and starting to sort of question, as it were, question authority, as it were, particularly the authority of the monarchies and the divine right of kings. So, of course, there will be the inevitable comparison between the American and French revolutions, right? Because the French Revolution started almost immediately after the American Revolution ended. And between the two of them, they were probably the driving political events of this period. So you would expect questions of whatever type to compare and contrast not only the origins, the great thinkers, the driving forces, but sort of where they went, because they went in their results. The American Revolution, of course, gave us the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. French Revolution gave them the guillotine. And ultimately, the French Revolution led to the rise of Napoleon, who was probably the most influential person of the 18th century. His changes, as it says here, the end of the Ancien Regime. Napoleon pretty much put Europe in a blender and hit the blend button. Europe before Napoleon, Europe after Napoleon, totally different. For those of you that give history a little more look like I do, Napoleon was also a significant change in the way that warfare was conducted. We see, although sadly the AP World History doesn't discuss it very much, Napoleon really brought about the notion of total war and the nation in arms. You can derive a pretty linear relationship between the rise of Napoleon and his changes to military science, the military arts, strategy, tactics, and operations. Some of his influences on the military are still in place today. Fun fact. And of course, independence comes to Latin America, the revolts of the Spanish Empire. We see this first in Latin America proper, in Venezuela, then moving up to Mexico. more on this in a moment. So we see that the beginning of decolonization and nationalism, again, we see that the Latin American countries start to exert their own identity and their own independence. So I would expect great numbers of potential questions on the causes, events, players, and impacts of all of these revolutions. Compare, contrast, continuity, change. You know what I mean. Of course, to go along with this is the Industrial Revolution, which had a direct effect on everything else because improvements to agriculture allowed a great population growth. This was the era when you'll see the philosophers talking, the great Malthusian, that we're going to have great famines, a great extinction of mankind because we can't feed everybody, consistently proven wrong for 200 years. But for the most part, improvements to agriculture not only changes the demographics by allowing great population increases, the technological improvements to agriculture, more importantly, mean that you need a smaller percent of your population to feed everybody, right? Instead of everybody having to be a farmer to feed people, now you can have fewer people farming, but still producing enough to feed the population. And of course, we have new inventions. A lot of people don't realize, because we're used to living in a highly technological age, that we kind of get, ho-hum, another new invention. This was an era when there were truly world-changing inventions, such as railroads, the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, the telegraph, the telephone, the light bulb, and ultimately radio. The steamship and the telegraph, again, had not only a great influence on commercial changes to the world, but, yes, the grouchy historian, military forces were radically changed in this period because of technology. Naval warfare in particular, because you now had steam engines, you could go upriver instead of just following the current downriver. You were no longer dependent upon the wind to engage in naval battles. And of course, railroads allowed you to move large numbers of troops and materiel across great distances very quickly. The American Civil War was one of the first wars fought with a lot of these new inventions. The telegraph, railroads, steam engines revolutionized warfare during this period. More importantly, these new inventions were coupled with the rise of the factory system. We see here the invention of Eli Whitney. Not only did he invent the cotton gin that allowed cotton to become the predominant cash crop in the South, but he also invented the notion of interchangeable parts. This was pretty radical in an era where you basically had craftsmen creating one-of-a-kind inventions, particularly, let's just pick my favorite, firearms, right? Whitney's ability to create interchangeable parts that you could mass produce muskets was a revolution, and it gave rise to the factory system for all kinds of products and new methods of production. We see this in clothing in particular, right? All of the cotton grown in the South at this time fed the looms and factories of England producing cloth. You no longer had to have a woman sitting with a spinning wheel making cloth in small batches. Now you could go down to the general store and buy a bolt of it. This, of course, not only had an effect on the economic system, but there was a social aspect of it well, because, of course, you had to have people to work on the factories. Where would these people come from? Well, a lot of them came in from the countryside because they no longer needed to farm. There was sufficient farmers to raise food. So now you see you have an extensive growth of cities, and you see the implementation of what's called the factory system and the rise of the working class. People no longer owned land and worked the land. They were now wage earners. This, of course, like all things, caused some disruptions in society and caused economic inequality. So you have the competition of new economic and social philosophies, primarily free markets versus socialism. Here you have the beginnings of the clash of Adam Smith versus Karl Marx. And of course, we will see the rise of unions and the notion of social mobility. Not easy, very painful, but we see the beginnings of modern society being constructed here. And of course, we continue with the rise of nationalism and imperialism. This is the great period, the great race to colonize Africa, to colonize Asia. The one place they did not colonize, of course, was Latin America again. Once the Spanish were kicked out, the Americans came in with the Monroe Doctrine and said the Europeans are not going to build colonies back in the Western Hemisphere. But of course, these colonies are all about trade, conquest, and wealth. The other two great events during this period, particularly for European history, are the German and Italian unifications. The Prussians under Otto von Bismarck, within a period of about 20 years, have united all of those little principalities and duchies and whatever else's of Germany into a unified German state, which of course will have huge ramifications for European history in the 20th century. And of course, the various Italian states also unify. Now, you still have the Russians and the Ottomans during this period. And of course, the Russians are building their own empire. Modern Russia starts to take its shape and acquire the land mass that will become Russia. The Ottomans begin a very slow decline after they're turning back at the gates of Vienna in 1683. The Ottomans sort of fall behind the rest of Europe in terms of technology. There is no Ottoman empire beyond what they conquered up to 1683. And the Ottomans sort of fall behind in the Industrial Revolution and don't have the sort of dynamic growth of trade and industry that the rest of Europe does. However, those social changes do carry across the world beyond Europe, right? We see changes in Japan, in China. We see the regrowth of feudalism in Japan and the Meiji restoration of the Japanese Empire. And what we will start to see is the Chinese start to come under pressure from European colonial powers that want to exact commercial concessions out of the Chinese. So there is a lot going on to sort of, let's just say, call it for what it is, set us up for the fairly bloody 20th century. Lots of terms and conditions again here. You'll notice there's not a lot of people here. Again, persons, names, dates, places. The colonial wars in America, some of the outcomes of the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the Napoleonic Codes, urbanization. Again, the contrast between laissez-faire capitalism and socialism and communism. The notion of social Darwinism also rose here, so you probably want to study on that. Also, in Europe, politics, particularly driven by the notion of spheres of influence. Again, this is a notion that will carry into the 20th century and affect a great deal of 20th century politics. We also have two of the great engineering projects of the age, the Suez Canal, which cuts the need for merchant traffic, for sea traffic to go all the way around Africa. They can cut through the Mediterranean, go through the Suez Canal, and get straight into the Middle East and the Indian Ocean basin. The beginnings of the Panama Canal to prevent the need for ships to have to go all the way around South America to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And of course, the most important ideas of nationalism and imperialism that are going to carry into the 20th century. So a lot of terms here, again, just a sampling, but I would expect that all of these topics would be fair game for multiple choice, short answer, document-based, or more extensive essay questions. A lot going on in this period. This is sort of that bridge period where you see sort of the ultimate extension of European power. By the beginning of the 20th century, in 1900, Great Britain is pretty much the most powerful country in the world in terms of economic, in terms of the size of its empire, the size of its navy, not necessarily its army, but certainly its navy. And you'll see that the competing pressures of nationalism, imperialism, spheres of influence are all going to set up the world for the great catastrophe that is to come. I hope you found this video useful. We hope to see you in the next one. And don't forget, take those practice exams.